After Japan's surrender in World War II, the Korean peninsula had been divided by a 38th parallel. While the Soviet Union backed the North, they established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea today. While in the South, the Republic of Korea, widely known as South Korea, was formed under the territory of the United States. While the Soviet Union held the northern part of the 30th parallel, the United States held the south. Of course, by the time World War II was over, they didn't have a reason to have the military power there, so by 1947, both the United States and the Soviet Union pulled out of the military, leaving both governments to decide what kind of government they wanted to form. And so came the rise of Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader at the time, who wanted to reunify the entire Korean peninsula. So, given already the ongoing conflicts in 30th parallel, what did he decide to do? Conquer South Korea. Yeah, he decided to make an attack on South Korea. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea began a surprise attack with the support of Soviet forces. They wanted to reunify the entire Korean peninsula and make it under communist rule. So they quickly took over the, I'm pretty sure it was called Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. Now, just to reify that South Korea was really not prepared for this at all, just because they didn't see why North Korea would attack them, and they had just begun their government, so they were pretty small at the time compared to North Korea that had the entire support from China and the Soviet forces. And so this civil war triggered participation from nations across the world. For instance, the UN began to back up South Korea by selling military forces, and then over time the United States began to participate in the civil war between North and South because they saw it as a direct threat to their ideology of democracy. So this dynamic fight between capitalism and communism, which had been ongoing for multiple decades now, is known as the Red Scare. And this war between North and South Korea was seen as a proxy war, where the United States essentially had to step into the war, or else it would appear to be weak as a democratic country. Eventually, although the Soviet Union was providing support for North Korea, China eventually stepped in. While North Korea had Kim Il-sung, the United States had General Douglas MacArthur. Actually, I believe he wanted to nuke China 2 times, which is why he got fired from his position, but that's another topic. So after 3 years of basically stalemate, where North Korea and their other forces would take the major part of the peninsula, and then the South Korea, the UN, and America would take back part of the North. It was essentially a stalemate, and after 3 years, they were essentially forced to sign a truce. But despite this, I guess you could say, loss, because, well, what does it say about the United States, a big power that could even take over Korea, let alone defeat China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea? There was a lot of propaganda spreading around to keep Americans with their sense of patriotism. And in today's video, I wanted to analyze a film that Ronald Reagan sponsored. So essentially, this film is titled The Ultimate Weapon, which was produced by Film Consultants of California, though now it's referenced online from the data archive that I saw as North Korean Brainwashing During Korean War with Ronald Reagan. Just like the title implies, this film is based on essentially how Americans get brainwashed, how they become prisoners of war, and how throughout their time at China or even in North Korea, they get brainwashed and they get dehumanized and treated very badly. Throughout this film, we can observe that the producers intentionally add subtle changes in the visuals to make the audience resent or hate communists. They portray Chinese people and people of North Korean descent as evil and make them seen as if they're the bad guys, which justifiably, considering what they did to prisoners of war, is reasonable. Although we also did the same thing, but anyways, this film is obviously meant to swim the American viewpoint of Americans back home, as if there isn't support for more wars in the future, then how is Ronald Reagan going to keep on fighting? Now we're going to step in through some visual analysis where we can observe this more clearly. Within the first minute, the setting we're presented in is the brainwashing of Chinese troops by a teacher. They're shown very untrue and stereotypical facts about Americans. The text portrays a very biased and negative viewpoint of Americans and acts as a medium of justification for the Chinese troops to attack them, as if it were self-defense. Since this was shown on a film television to average Americans, we can imagine that the dimming of light contributes meaning as it exemplifies what we consider to be like evil planning. This lack of light, combined with the camera angles that makes us seem as if we're part of the audience, makes the American viewer intuitively disagree with the list. The list that says, can't think for himself, lacks self-confidence, lacks concern for others, and no standard of right and wrong, undermines a typical American. And obviously, if you're being offended, you're going to disagree with what they're saying. And then we can also mention that even though at the time of the film was produced there wasn't color, you can easily tell how they used this lack of light or color in general to their advantage. Then the entire film is very sad and melancholic, and they use this lack of light to make their point that it's not a pretty sight what they're doing to the prisoners of war. This total lack of light is, well, symbolic of evil. The overall portrayal supports the intuitive notion that Americans had of communists back home. Ronald Reagan only adds to the hatred that Americans currently have against their only notion of what communism is. In this image, the first thing that the audience notices is how a Chinese trooper aims her gun straight at the audience. Even in the comfort of the American's home, we can see how the subtle gesture could add paranoia to the average American. Being threatened in this manner can incite a sense of resentment against a communist, which in this case is a Chinese or Korean person. This yet again is another example of how Ronald Reagan uses the stereotype of the Chinese or the Korean as being bad since they're holding a gun that is symbolic of death in the war to threaten the Americans back home. Even if you look at his facial features, you can see that he has a face that he's literally about to kill you. And Americans back home aren't going to take that lightly, considering the fact that they're imprisoning their fellow Americans. They're not going to be happy with that. So loss is symbolic of saddened emotions for Americans. Americans feel for their own people. Losing one of theirs to a dreaded enemy, or a communist in this case, only hardens the hatred the Americans experience against their enemies. The high amount of dim light that we observe in this scene represents death. Even if you look at their faces of the two people that are looking down at the dead body, we can tell that they're really sad over his death, and that you can easily tell that they're in a very dehumanized environment where they can't even bury the body. Another emotion that this film uses to spread paranoia is the sense of hopelessness. Even during a missed war, hope from back home is what keeps American going. The faith they have that their troops are trying their best to win is what fuels the American to keep on believing that Ronald Reagan or even the war is going to be fine. However, the juxtaposition between this belief and what the film actually portrays is very different. In this scene, through the observation of facial features, we can depict that the prisoner of war has lost all sense of hope. The ideology of freedom and resilience is evidently gone from what we can tell in this scene. The sense that even our fellow American troopers can lose hope and give in to the enemy spreads more paranoia to the average American, as they can only imagine how far worse they were actually treated. So in conclusion, the Soviet Union was far from being terminated. We know it was terminated in the late 70s, which means that Ronald Reagan needed more support from the people from the US to keep on funding these wars and to have people be content with what he's doing, to invoke a sense of justice in them and to portray the enemy as bad so they can keep on attacking them and defending their own sense of patriotism. So I'd say Americans were pretty justified in their paranoia. I mean, imagine if you have a loved one that's being taken away from you and that's going to war, and all of a sudden he's a prisoner at war, and you see this film that is of how he or she is being mistreated, then obviously you would justify that paranoia because you can only imagine what other worse things they can do, or even if they theoretically keep on winning wars. And this tie between North Korea and South Korea is symbolic of how the United States was unable to overcome that feat and how they're weaker than they seem. And so it's normal for Americans to fear that the US was unable to beat them in the Korean War. As we see even later in the 50s, this paranoia keeps on fostering, and it gets to the point where it won't be rid of until the Soviet Union essentially falls apart. All in all, I would say this film is very representative of how Americans felt at the time. They had these stereotypes about communism, about people from China and North Koreans specifically, and this film only basically threw coal into the fire. They confirmed, or at least they used confirmation bias in order to make the people back at home agree with their own personal beliefs and incite this unanimous hatred against the communists, which was very needed at the time of war. So, thank you.